What can I say about Gojo that hasn't been said already? Gojo has taken the anime community by storm and has become one of the most popular characters in anime. In my personal opinion, he's the best written character in the series and has so much to him as a character. So let's dive into Gojo's character and explain to you why Gojo Satoru is a perfect character. Satoru Gojo has the luxury of being fleshed out in all aspects. We have his entire life shown to us and a flashback to his youth days. But the first aspect of characterization starts with his curse technique, which is the foundation of who Gojo Satoru is. The Limitless and Six Eyes, something that hasn't existed for 400 years. But this blessed individual has invoked an impact on the series like no other. The birth of Gojo was that of a mythical creature. He single-handedly changed the balance of the Jujutsu world. He became an object of fear for Jujutsu sorcerers and curse users alike. A walking barrier, something that can't be comprehended, which set him up for his rightful title as the strongest Jujutsu sorcerer. The Limitless itself is a perfect example of how curse techniques reflect the user. It starts off with the barrier that separates him from the world, enemies, and being understood from humanity. The neutral infinity conceptually fits Gojo's character so well. The infinity is the barrier between him and everyone else, in combat sense and a detachment to enemies and friends alike. The upgrading of the technique and his other abilities coincide with his character arc so well. Let me give you an example in Hidden Inventory. Before becoming the Honored One, he could not keep Limitless on 24/7. There was also the moment where the title of the strongest was shared with Geto, truly showing he wasn't completely isolated as a character. Now you may think I'm reaching, but let me explain a little more. The neutral infinity is described as inviolable, something that has to be respected and could not be removed or ignored. As a technique, it's developed to become something that can differentiate between enemies and to be ran automatically, which conceptually shows the gradual isolation the Limitless does to Gojo power-wise and separating himself from other sorcerers. It's taken to a next level when the only time he takes the Limitless down is when he chooses to, is in relation to those he can show weakness to. For example, Yuji patting him on the back before his fight against Sukuna, letting Yaga hit him to read the room. The dropping of the Limitless is his claim to humanity in a metaphorical sense and literally. He can be hit just like any human. He's prone to weakness just like any human. His powers are his greatest claim to his overwhelming title as the strongest and the barrier between him and humanity. This cements the Limitless' inviolable rule to Gojo Satoru the strongest and Gojo Satoru the human, a barrier between himself. This is taken to a step further with his technique. Before he became the Honored One, Blue was his main source of power. Blue is an application of the neutral Limitless, which works like attraction. The irony is when he's only had access to Blue is where he's most connected to humanity, as someone in his respective plane in the title of the strongest in Geto. The unlocking of Red and becoming the Honored One, the power to repel can signify the overwhelming strength he gained, will isolate him further, and is beautifully showcased with his relationship with Geto. Finally, the hollow technique, purple, a combination of the two, and we reach the word hollow, having a hole, an empty space, and a perfect representation of his identity crisis. Let me support this with one of the best panels of Gojo. When Gojo is getting sealed by the prison bell, and he looks into the eye of the prison well, what reflects back is nothing, the idea of a void, or rather, hollow. Gojo looked into himself and all he could see was nothing in the making of his identity, a paradox between human and calamity. But I want to touch upon this a little later when I go more into depth into his identity crisis. But the concept of Limitless has even more exploration to go, and we touch onto his domain expansion, Unlimited Void. Ironic, isn't it? Given everything but unable to do anything. There's one quote Gojo said to Jogo is probably my favourite use of irony in the series and projects Gojo to a T. He's a one in the million born with special powers. He has a sense of individuality that separates him from the weak. He's put in the work to separate himself from just being carried by his powers and is a powerhouse within his own realm, but cannot achieve what he truly wants. Geto, Shibuya, Megumi, the power to reign supreme, but the contradiction is his character prevents him from succeeding. It looks like being strong isn't enough. I can only save those who want to be saved. With this quote we set up the next stage of his character, to quell his loneliness and to prevent the youth experiencing the dilemma he feels within his own identity. Having strong allies that will overthrow the Jujutsu world, it stems from his selflessness and selfishness, but to truly understand this, we have to tackle the concept of Gojo's identity crisis. Jujutsu Kaisen as a series is greatly appreciated when reread countless times. The structure and how meticulous Akutami is when setting up the beats of his thematic framework is only truly appreciated in totality, just like any other story. But in the case of Gojo, how he's characterized and starting off as the series as the pinnacle adds another layer to that. If I asked you what's the most important thematic elements within Jujutsu Kaisen, what would you say? Well, I can't ask you, so let me tell you what I believe are the most important things from the story. Agency, individuality, the concept of death, and the importance of a role. Within Gojo we see all stages. Granted, he has the luxury of having a full character arc, but the most important aspect and we're introduced is Gojo is the strongest. In most shonen stories, do correct me if I'm wrong or just ignorant, the concept of the strongest is normally showcased early within the story as a mention or a brief showcase. Then with gradual increase in power, that ceiling is then used to ham in how far the protagonists need to reach to topple that unstoppable force. Within Jujutsu Kaisen we are introduced to the strongest straight away. More importantly, one of them is on the protagonist's side of the story, and the setup for the most pivotal fight in Gojo and Sukuna's character arcs is set up within the first 2 chapters of Jujutsu Kaisen. The story characterizes Gojo as the strongest, and his impact narratively and physically embodies the entire series. For those who know Gojo, he's their trusted sensei, but also the strongest. To those who don't know Gojo personally, he's an object of fear and also the strongest. To the power system and the early focus on human versus curses, the reason curses have become stronger than ever before is because of said object, the strongest Gojo Satoru. In the same breath Sukuna is characterized as a calamity, Gojo represents the same in the Jujutsu world, because at any time, Gojo can strike and ruin the said establishment, truly categorizing the element of strength as a force of nature, truly shackling him as a weapon for the Jujutsu world. Gege constantly talks about the roles the character have within the fanbook. For example, Todo was meant to be the Kenpachi figure. Sukuna is accumulation of the lore and fictional knowledge he read, and Gojo's role was to be the power ceiling, which was highly evident within Jujutsu Kaisen. His ceiling led to the world to go into chaos. His impact in the verse could not be more significant, as the greatest balance usher was removed. The role of the strongest was solely assigned to Gojo before he could even speak. A birth so powerful his impact is everlasting. The curse of this overwhelming gift is the burden the strongest has to hold. He is a title, not an individual, which has spearheaded an expectation on him before he can assume his own identity. But does Gojo reject this persona? Does he have any issue with being the strongest? Is the role forced upon him a detriment like a Toji or a Maki? Before this question is answered, I'll introduce some of the most pivotal dynamics within Gojo's character arcs, being Geto, Toji, and Sukuna. The impact of Geto's character cannot be understated, his true best friend, and a character who was his initial moral compass and the first who saw him beyond his role as the strongest. Gojo in Hidden Evertory judged people purely on strength and did not attach meaning to protecting the weak. It could be argued that this is a case of nurture versus nature. Option 1. Nature. Did Gojo being born with these special gifts wrap his mindset to be opposed to helping the weak? Option 2. Nurture. Does his environment and standards put onto him cultivate his mindset of survival of the fittest? Or option 3. A combination of both? The answer really is number 3, and Geto is an instrumental aspect to his character, but number 1 becomes even more interesting with the recent chapter and fate tied to the Sugiwara. With not knowing the previous 6 Eyes users, Kenjaku uses them as the biggest threats that pose in his plan, which we can infer that they are the benchmark for the strongest. Not to mention the link of fate tied with Tengen. But with Yuta then assuming that role becoming the monster, it adds to so much a predetermined fate of a 6 Eyes user. Is it their fate? Do they lack the agency to break through their fate? So many questions arise. But let me back this up with the fate of the Zenin clan. Their core theme resides in death and rebirth. Naoya, Toji, Maki, and eventually Megumi all experience a fate akin to death, and then are reborn with a shift within their character arc. Accepting a new beginning such as Toji or Maki, or rejecting your fate such as Naoya. It sets up an interesting dilemma for Megumi, how clans seem to have some predetermined fate within their own agency. This is why Geto is so important. He sees Gojo beyond any role of what's assigned to him and sees him as a human. The title of the strongest doesn't isolate him, and he can care for those weaker because of Geto, who was an extension of his moral compass. But the pivotal change is when he becomes the honored one. Part of Gojo's isolation is self-inflicted in 2 aspects. His persona as the strongest and his inability to try and let others understand him because he already lost the one person that did. Geto failed to reconnect with Gojo because he wasn't needed to be by Gojo's side. He couldn't run the same race Gojo was in. The strength gap became too big, then they lost a foundational part of their connection and the need for Geto to help in his missions. Gojo saw this as him abandoning him and projected his own loneliness to a fault of himself. I'm not strong enough to save those who don't want to be saved. They both project their insecurities onto one another when a simple conversation before could have changed everything. It becomes even crazier when their goals both arise from not being fulfilled by the other. Gojo's search for his ally is what he once had in Geto, which is why he shoulders the burden all by himself, whether it's killing the higher-ups or going to Shibuya on his own. The irony is Gojo is wrong, and people like Yuta try to understand him, but the thought of history repeating himself made him lament in his isolation. Geto wanted a utopia for sorcerers, so moments with Riko won't happen again. He won't be isolated from his friend, because there'll be nothing to fight for. He won't lose his purpose and moral compass, and because there'll be nobody to protect. He won't lose his best friend because he won't have to be seen as a weapon for the purpose of the Jujutsu world. Why when he asked that pivotal question to Gojo, because he has the required strength to create that utopia and free them both from their suffering. They both searched for things they had in each other and both ended up wrong. Are you the strongest because you're Satoru Gojo, or are you Satoru Gojo because you're the strongest? To truly understand this quote, 236 is the best chapter for Gojo. You can make a flower bloom, you can admire it, but you can't tell that flower I want you to understand me. Let me pause this real quick and answer the question. Well, Geto is asking Gojo is simply the nature versus nurture point I brought up earlier. And through his fight with Sukuna, he proved being Gojo makes him who he is beyond the gifts given. But let's switch it to the perspective of Gojo, and we'll truly understand why he relishes in his persona as the strongest. Gojo called the students flowers. Early in the chapter, he wished Geto was a part of the group patting his back. Gojo distinguishes himself as something above a flower, but something he fosters. Something delicate but can also be plucked so easily, metaphorically showing the divide between him and humanity. He wants the best for them, but his persona as the strongest means he knows they won't be able to understand him, or so he thinks. He projects his feelings onto Geto, and that's why they drifted apart, because the weak can't understand the strong. It's why he feels no need to confide in his students, either because they are not him. He adds a greater emphasis to why he wanted to fight Sukuna, why he wanted to give his all, why he wanted to show Sukuna love, because him being human is the one thing he lacked, being understood. The irony is Geto still cares for him, and he cares for Geto. His students care for him beyond his role as a weapon, and he internally pushes them away due to the experience which fully completes his dynamic with Geto. It doesn't stop him from caring for Geto, or his students, but it sets as a major reason to why he pushes to helping the youth. This is further backed with Megumi and other students, but I'll start with Megumi as he's placed a greater emphasis on him than anyone else, and to force my point on him looking outwards from Lucas Geto. Gojo only recruits students with talent, not to mention he plays a pretty passive role in making them stronger, which is a contradiction to his overall goal of raising a new generation, but he seems to have a deeper connection with Megumi. 1. Megumi is a clownhead just like himself. The expectations of him is big just like himself. The most important quote he said to Megumi is "Don't get left behind by me." This drives some important things. He's not going to limit himself because he enjoys his persona as the strongest, but he also expects Megumi to be someone to rival him, and why he constantly brings up the previous 10 shadows and limitless clan heads. You can definitely say it's out of genuine care, but there's also a hint of unfair expectations placed on Megumi, simply because he wants another Geto and someone from a family head background would be more likely. In the fanbook it stated he only seeks out those who are strong, and helps Yuji and Yuta simply for that reason. But with Gojo being human, his care for them to enjoy their youth is just as important, and it's also why he respected Megumi's wishes to save Yuji. So why do I say this? Well, Gojo's stuck between two sides. He won't actively help them get stronger unless they ask, leaving them with their own agency, but also sets an unrealistic goal of them matching the second ever strongest sorcerer to live, which is why he's both selfish and selfless. It's why he'll kill the Jujutsu higher-ups to protect the youth, but will also set a near impossible bar to reach, a 1 in a million talent as himself, and speaks to the complexity of Gojo. Two characters who contribute to Gojo's identity crisis in different ways are Toji and Sukuna, both for different reasons, but their biggest influence is a drastic shift within its character. They both share the similarity of breaking through his infinity, which serves as either a drastic change in his character or solving his identity crisis. Let's start off with Toji. I previously explained a lot of how Geto and Gojo's dynamic was formed and had been impactful through multiple factors in the story. But the reason for this due to these external factors being Riko and Toji, and in Gojo's case Toji is pivotal to the Gojo we meet in modern day. The dynamic is still one of the greatest in the series. Two blessed individuals. Now I put blessed in quotation marks because how their special powers are presented in the series couldn't be further from each other. The heavenly restriction user being an outcast and not appreciated, compared to the Six Eyes mutation being revered and treated as the pinnacle of Jujutsu sorcery. A man who broke free from cursed energy, being part of a clan that is constantly on the search for talented curse techniques. To the point incest is their prominent way of keeping the techniques in-house, leading to Toji being treated as subhuman. In contrast, Gojo's kind spoiled Gojo. They treated him special. And it's no surprise the world put him on a pedestal. They couldn't be further from each other. Then the moment they meet, Gojo becomes the first person to see him. An invisible man could be seen once again. No wonder he has such an inferiority complex towards Gojo. But let me not spend too much time on their dynamic. I can make that a separate video if you're interested. The inverted spear of heaven, something that can breach Gojo's safety and changed him forever. People often ask, why did he use the tool to finish off Gojo? An intelligent fighter made a very small mistake which could have changed the path of the Jujutsu world forever. A regular weapon is poetic, beating the pinnacle of the Jujutsu world with just a regular weapon, one he referred to as a blessing. He projects his inferiority onto Gojo and in terms feel validation by beating him just like anybody else. This is also backed up realistically by his second clash where he wanted to put down the strongest sorcerer and ended up straying away from his own path. Before I talk about the impact, they really are the opposites. Fate rejects Toji, but he's broken through fate and single-handedly flipped the world. Gojo is tied to fate and bound to it, with his purpose as a six-eyes user, and the burden that strength brings. Even the only one panel and Toji coming out of the domain being total opposites. Toji becomes free from Jujutsu and leaves his final wishes onto Gojo. With Gojo breaking through his infinity leads to the ascension of his character arc, and when he truly becomes a calamity. I don't feel vengeful, everything just feels right. He's on the greatest power high and fully embodied the mindset of a Sukuna and the parallels to the Buddha. With Toji representing Sun Wukong, who's a monkey who defied the system, and the gods and attained immortality through the narrative, it works so well. Whereas Gojo attains enlightenment, but is bounded by his human desire, which is showcased through his conversation with Geto. When they go to the Star Plasma Vessel, Gojo says let's kill them all. Geto tried to rationalize the situation, but I said Geto is an extension of his moral compass. But for the first time, Gojo said finding a purpose to do so isn't always needed, and a perfect example of Gojo truly being a calamity. The solution to being just like everyone else by infinity being breached is to separate himself further in power, and his power increase is perfectly demonstrated. Infinity begins to be run 24/7. He can automatically differentiate between threats and friends alike. This sets up for Gojo the strongest and Gojo the human and a conflict within his character forever until the fight with Sukuna. I mentioned previously when Gojo gets sealed, what he sees in himself is a void, a missing piece and a clash of his identity. The title of the strongest is not his no more, and now he has to reclaim what he once lost. The reason for this is Sukuna is free, a walking parasite who robs everything from people. Megami's 10 shadows, Yuji's future ending up making him an accomplice as a murderer. Gojo's title as the strongest and the current arc making people throw their humanity to stop him. He's literally eating away at people. Now Gojo, whose entire persona resolves about being the strongest, is challenged and he must reclaim it by fighting Sukuna. Sukuna inherently robs people of their place within the story, while even Yuji was reduced from a main character to Sukuna's vessel. So the ideological clashes between is all set up and it's a clash to reclaim what he once lost. Gojo, when explaining his time in the prison rafter, had no concept of time, but it's also draining like when a week would flash in an instant. In his closing moments, he also talked about not wanting to die in old age, and he's happy he lost to someone stronger. In an eerie manner, Gojo died in hidden inventory, and has been chasing after an impossible goal or waiting for it to be toppled. The actions of wanting people to be on his level, the implication of his fight being his selfish idea to prove himself, it all comes to pieces, and why even the fight is predominantly from Gojo's perspective, because Sukuna is the challenger to take his title, and to free him from the curse. If you want a better example of how confused Gojo is, the fight is the perfect example of this. At the start of the fight, he says he can wail in Megami, a bold-faced lie. Why would he need to take out his heart to bring him closer to death if he didn't care about Megami? Why would he not use hollow purple in other situations instead of red if he didn't care about Megami? The consistent theme within his character is humanity stops him from taking the next step and why he fails. Disaster Curse is not using Unlimited Void, caring about Rico against Toji. In the case, caring about Megami until a point of defeat which switched his perspective. It's why Sukuna called him greedy and why he's made to fail. The narrative punishes those who ask for more than what they are granted, and why the fight is truly special. When Sukuna called Gojo ordinary, people take this as a slight. But Sukuna not upgrading his technique, not being forced to go to drastic measures, means Gojo is just like everyone else, which is the tone of the conversation. But after this we see a drastic change in Gojo, where the concept of Megami doesn't exist, and he begins to relish in his persona as the strongest. There's no surprise Kashimo, another character with the strongest trope, could pick up on this and understood the importance of the fight to Gojo. Hitting the zone, onslaught after onslaught, and the fulfillment of fighting an adversary he could only dream of. It all comes full circle and later to the acknowledgement from Sukuna to tie his character. One aspect I love that isn't talked about is even the cap in their vision of strength. Sukuna came into this fight to upgrade himself and get stronger. Gojo relied on his instincts and what he had to do to fight against the opponent. He told Megumi you can't imagine a stronger version of yourself, and the irony he loses to Sukuna, who could foresee an instance of Mahoraga adapting to a level he can transcend, adding the bow to their respective mindsets. This could be due to the safety net he had of the technique, reducing the level he thought he could reach, which I think is quite interesting. But the most important aspect is the technique Sukuna did gain, the ability to cut the world, the space Gojo existed in, and free him from his curse. An attack so incomprehensible that the readers couldn't see it. An attack that literally cuts the page of the manga to suggest it's something beyond our understanding. The hedonist who can't be understood sends an attack that's not seen is genius. You think I'm reaching? Throughout the entire clash, Gojo is trying to catch up to Sukuna's plans. He's confused to why he isn't using the 10 shadows. He's surprised at how he can use domain expansion and domain amplification. He truly can't understand him. Not to mention, only once he explains the attack himself, we see it in the next instance against Kashimo. Cutting the space within infinity after he spent numerous times to make it unbeatable is the perfect way to separate him from the title as the strongest and back to the realm of the world. Infinity is a concept brought into the real world, so by shattering that existence it works perfectly. Not to mention the afterlife scene is the moment where he was not alone. He was the most happy, his spring youth, surrounded by all the people who cares about but his students and didn't have the burden his strength gave him. Not to mention it furthered the idea that no one can truly understand Sukuna, whether Yuzu, Sukuna or Ko, and concluded the conflict of the strongest. Now there's a lot to talk about Sukuna and Gojo wise, but I want to keep this primarily on Gojo. Maybe make a separate video because they're just my two favourite characters. But through death, Gojo is truly free, while him coming back would betray a lot of his themes. We're now met with a scenario in this chapter and further shows why Gojo is truly not understood. In 236, Nanami projected his thoughts on Gojo. He wills Jujutsu selfishly. And yes, it's true, but also not, because he does as an extension of protecting others as well. Gojo has been seen as a tool for the Jujutsu world, and the fact post his death that is still occurring is to hammer it down narratively. Yuta then assigns the role as a monster, but would that be truly what Gojo wants? He'll be happy to see they're doing what they can to save people they care about, something he couldn't do with Geto. But he'll also be upset that Yuta is bounding him to the same fate he fell to, where he has to carry that burden as the strongest. The concept of Sugiwara curse I alluded to could tie that in perfectly, but plays on a cruel fate, and while Sukuna narratively has begun to win because he acknowledges people who will go the extra mile. He's called the Fallen One, and he drags people to his plane of rejecting humanity, making Yuta's whole plan tragic, even if it's in line with his mindset to protect people. But all is not doom and gloom, because there are others close to Yuta's level that can save him, which will break free from the curse Gojo was assigned to, and his true goal of having a new generation can come to pass. If for his ideals like Geto he can become the monster and still be saved, then Yuta will not be bounded by the fate of Gojo and he can live through the dream he has set. But if Yuta is to fall, and other characters abandon their humanity to defeat Sukuna, the cycle continues, which truly speaks to how tragic Gojo's character is. More than just that, it hammers down that Jujutsu sorcerers truly are a cog regardless of the title assigned. Gaining freedom or breaking through conventional understanding is the only way to stop the cycle. Overall, Gojo's impact will forever be there, through life and death, and he's the greatest character in Jujutsu Kaisen. The irony that his fanbase really thinks the author hates him could be some meta commentary, that people in verse and in real life truly don't understand Gojo. He's a character who's so very human, why it makes it so great, and the greatest loser to ever do it. He's a tragic character, and even through death, that narrative's enforced, and one of my favourite ever characters.